Kenny, I have a question. I don't think I talked to you about this. I have a question for you about the aftermath of this. Looking back now, I guess it's 5-6 weeks later. Basketball aside, almost because it's hard to judge with all the Mavs injuries and everything like that. Basketball aside, what's your sort of feeling on the visceral Dallas fan reaction?
I think it's all warranted, man. I have a couple guys who were previously Mavs fans in my life. One of them just denounced his fandom completely like a week after this. Like he took a week to figure out if he wanted to be a Mavs fan anymore and ended up being no. And I think it was when Quentin Grimes dropped 44 that he was like, nah, I can't support this team anymore. They traded Q Grimes. I didn't experience this exactly. But when Derrick Rose got traded from Chicago, that was the one time in my fandom where I was like, I don't know if I can support this team. Whole different thing because Derrick Rose was coming off 2 big injuries. He hadn't really played as much. We talking about Luka Doncic, who's still one of the top 3 players in the world. And I completely understand how they feel because for us, sports is entertainment, obviously, but it's also like life in a way. I know it's your life because you literally playing it, but like for the fans, there's nothing more exciting than to see your favorite team be successful. And for them to be coming off a finals run and they make this dramatic of a change, I completely understand the protesting. I completely understand everything that they did. And I think it was all warranted, honestly. And it feels bad because Anthony Davis is one of the greatest players ever, too. And I feel bad for him because he's always going to have this lens on him that's like he was a part of the Luka trade. And I don't think he'll ever be really appreciated by the Mavs fans for that reason alone, just because he's so closely attached to Luka, who is, I mean, in his 7 years, we can say he's the second best Maverick of all time, only behind Dirk. So I feel bad for AD, but I understand all of the fandom, man. I really do.
What do you think?
One, I think it highlights from a bird's eye view a huge part of the NBA, where that how many leagues could players being traded make that many people denounce their fandom to a team? You know what I mean? Or to have that visceral, that type of reaction. I don't blame them. I having played there in the playoffs, having kind of, they had just been to the finals, and it just seems so random. Your team is in a fine place, like it's like you can poise yourself to make a trip back, and you saw a great playoff. So it leaves them asking a lot of whys, and maybe these are whys that we'll never understand. We'll maybe never understand what went through management's head to make that trade. Maybe there's stuff behind the scenes that is not for us to know, but the fans they're not going to care about that. Like they lost somebody that was really important. So I get it. Like I can't blame them at all. And I completely agree with you, Kenny. It's just like AD don't deserve that. He's going and he's always going to be compared, and he's never going to be fully appreciated in Dallas for that reason. And it's going to be on him to kind of perform beyond that. And with Kyrie going down, it just kind of adds just fuel to the fire. And you feel for them as a fan base, but it's also just part of the league where this crazy stuff happens. And honestly, it is entertaining.
Anthony Davis is one of the best players in the world. Like I think, like that's the crazy part. He's an All NBA player, All Defensive player. He's on any given night, arguably the best player on the floor, the best player on the floor. There's been stretches over the last several Lakers seasons where 2-3 weeks of the NBA season, he's the best player in the league, and that's why it's like sometimes from a fan perspective, I saw the day after the reaction. But then from a basketball perspective, you could somewhat understand it, right? Like you have a big defense and things like that. But again, the Dallas fans, you get attached. Like Luka's bigger than just basketball, right? He's clearly throughout all this, people have seen like this was a global story, like the magnitude of it. But I mean, clearly for Dallas now, they're going to be judged off the next 3 playoff runs, right? This year you could probably scratch off, but the next 3 years after this, I mean, that's really their window to go win a championship. So, like, we might not know who the winner, quote unquote, of this trade is. And maybe people already have it in their mind who the winner of the trade is. But to me, if you're a Dallas fan, like, let's see how this team could look and, what noise could we make?
What I'm curious about, and we can't make this judgment now. We probably can't make it for, 3 or 4 years. But I do wonder whether it's going to change the scope of how teams make these decisions. The comp that I made to Trey last week was, in a weird way, even though it wasn't a trade, it was free agency. When the Giants let Saquon walk, basically knowing he was going to Philly, what that did to their fan base. It made it even worse that he goes and has that year and wins a Super Bowl. But when there's like a lack of care about the feelings of your fans, and the fans can kind of feel that. And even the fact that this wasn't telegraphed at all, like it's very different if, someone's, a free agent next year. There's been all kinds of rumblings about, they want to go home or they want to go somewhere else or whatever it is. And like, it's like at that point, it's like, this is delaying the inevitable.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like rip the Band-Aid off, some divorce happens, separation happens, blah, blah, blah. But like when you basically, because I think the other, thing that you mentioned, Kenny, is there's a financial component. You look at people and they're like, we spent, all of this emotional bandwidth. We also spent all this money supporting this team. And it's like, they don't care about us.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious if teams, they're still going to be doing stuff like this all the time. But if they're going to like have more of the thought in their back of the mind of like, oh, we can't just do whatever we want with no regard for our brand, because their brand right now is not in a good place.
Yeah.
And I think it's a very, it's just a very interesting kind of phenomenon that I don't think we've really seen outside of the scale of just what the actual on the court effect was.
Yeah, on a lesser scale, when you talked about, management thinking about the fan base itself, again, lesser scale, I remember when the KG Paul Pierce to Brooklyn trade happened and how much those two players meant to Boston. Championship, finals run, conference finals run. Obviously, fans weren't too happy about it, but obviously it resulted in them eventually having Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. I think this trade is just so different is because you gave up the 26-year-old for the 32-year-old. So, you can convince your fans if you're Boston, like, hey, these draft picks in 4 years are going to be worth it. A lot of times they don't end up being worth it, but in that case it was. Convincing the Mavericks fan that ACL injury for Kyrie Irving, that could take him out of completely all of next year. Like if you think about when Jamal Murray got injured, he missed the rest of that season and the following season as well. So 32 years old, 33 years old, now our window is pushed by 2 years. It's just going to be tougher to convince the fans of that. And I think that's one of the main reasons why even people that can look at it from bird's eye view and say this roster is a good roster when healthy still can't buy in completely because now we still have to wait 2 more years to see it at its peak.
Yeah, I think the other side of that, like you said, is you trading younger for a little older, and it always seemed like Luka had so much love for Dallas. Like he only outwardly showed that he loved the city and the fans loved him, and it was just like it was one of those things that you thought like, oh, I guess he'd always be there. Like what could what would be the situation that forces him out? So that's a good point you make. It's just that like that's where the confusion comes in, where you have somebody 26 years old, like he has a lot of good basketball ahead of him. And it's just that's very valid.